Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll start by talking a bit about myself. I grew up in a military family. My father was in the Air Force, and in the very early 1960s, we were living at Ellsworth Air Force Base, a B-52 bomber base in South Dakota. And we were there during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I was one of those young kids crawling under my desk, fearful, terrified. And now here in today's world, we're facing those same crazy, crazy moments again. In 1971, wanting to be like my dad, I joined the Air Force myself and was sent to this base, Travis Air Force Base in California. It was an airlift base for the war in Vietnam. GIs would come to the base and get on planes and go to Vietnam. And when the planes would return, they would bring the body bags of the dead soldiers, and also the walking wounded would come. So every weekend, there were protests outside the base. Not a lot of people, similar kind of protests that many of us have participated in, but it created a dynamic on the base that really helped change my life. And it was at Travis that I became a peace activist. I want to begin by talking about the origins of the US space program. The upper right picture is on the right is Wernher von Braun, the famous German rocket scientist who was a member of the SS, building the V1 and V2 rocket for Hitler. And just next to him, sharing that piece of paper, is Major General Walter Dornberger. He was Hitler's liaison between von Braun and Hitler. Anything von Braun wanted, it was Dornberger's job to get it for von Braun. And they set up inside of a mountain tunnel a concentration camp called Dora. And to this place, they brought tens of thousands of Jews and gypsies and French resistance fighters, communists, homosexuals, and all kinds of people to act as slaves to build the rockets. And soon some of the slaves began to sabotage the operation. And they hung 100 of them in front of everyone as a warning. Don't you dare sabotage this program. And so towards the end of the World War II, Hitler was losing, and they began to fire the V1 and V2 rockets onto London and Paris and Brussels in desperation. And after the war was over, the United States brought 1,500 Nazi operatives to the US, and 100 of those were von Braun and his rocket team. They were first brought to New Mexico and then to Huntsville, Alabama, where they created the US space program. And the rest is history. And so in the early 60s, once the US developed the ability to send rockets off the planet, they exploded a hydrogen bomb in space. This created a lot of fear back on the Earth, and out of that grew the desire on the part of the US and the UK and the USSR, the former Soviet Union, to create the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. The Outer Space Treaty banned weapons of mass destruction in space. It didn't ban any other kind of weapons in space, just weapons of mass destruction. But it also said that nobody could put bases on the moon or other planetary bodies, and no one could claim ownership of any of the planetary bodies. The treaty said that the heavens would be the province of all humankind. Fast forward to the late 1990s when the US Space Command was created. This document on the left, Vision for 2020, talked about how the US will control space and dominate space and deny other countries access to space, that the US would be the master of space. I often wonder, that slogan, master of space, it reminds me of that German Nazi slogan. You remember it? Deutschland über alles, Germany over all. And I wonder if the introduction of 1,500 Nazis into America somehow increased our belief that we should be the master of space. And in fact, Dornberger, who again was the liaison between Hitler and Wernher von Braun, he testified before the Congress in the early days, soon after he came to this country. And he said to the Congress, "Gentlemen, I didn't come to this country to lose the Third World War. I lost two already." And so today we have the United States Space Force. On the left is a picture of a woman officer being sworn in to the Space Force. And I found the use of these Star Wars figures very interesting in this picture, because I felt like that it was an indication how they were trying to popularize this Space Force, this idea of war in the heavens with the public. Because, you know, kids in another 15, 20 years, they're going to be taxpayers, and they want them to support this program in the future. So the US over the years has created this international space surveillance network. And today the US has created downlink stations all over the planet. So as satellites orbit the Earth, they beam the signals to the Earth below to these downlink stations that are in places. On the left is a place called Fylingdales up in Yorkshire, England. And on the right, it's a place called Pine Gap way out in the bush country of Australia. But there are many of these places like this all over the planet that relay the signals in real time, split-second time, so that the US can intercept all phone, fax, and email communications, can look at the Earth below, identify targets, and use these technologies both on the ground and in space to direct targets, direct attacks to any place on the Earth in just literally seconds. So this is what they do. And they say that all warfare today on the planet is coordinated by space technology. So no matter whether you're a troop on the ground, carrying a gun, driving around in a tank, whether you're on a ship, whether you're on an airplane, doesn't matter. Whatever you do is coordinated and directed by space technology. And so the US has created a mass of satellites orbiting the Earth that help relay all of these signals. And now 5G has become a part of this program. 5G, they say, will have major military applications. It will allow the military to increase their what they call kill chain by having quicker reaction times between the satellites and the ground stations and what they call the warfighter. And so the planet is being surrounded by all of these satellites today. Years ago, this was a weapon system introduced by the Pentagon called the Death Star, orbiting battle station, being able to, they called it the space-based laser in addition to the Death Star. And they said that one of the problems with the Death Star was that it needed enormous power projection capability. And they said the only way they could power this thing would be with nuclear reactors on board the Death Star. They've not yet perfected the technology, but they're working on it today. This is the X-37, the successor to the space shuttle that was retired a few years ago. The X-37 is really a super drone. It's a pilotless space vehicle, military space vehicle, that has shown that it can stay in orbit for more than a year at a time. And it opens its bay doors, and it has several capabilities. Number one, it has a robotic arm that could grab another country's satellite, or it could release weapons that could destroy other countries' satellites, or even fire those weapons from this X-37 to targets on the Earth below. This is a technology that they call RODS, R-O-D-S, rods from God. An orbiting battle station with tungsten steel rods that would be used to fire these rods towards the Earth, picking up speed as it comes through Earth gravity. And it would be used to hit the underground missile silos of China and Russia in a US first strike attack. This is one reason why Russia and China for more than 10 years have been saying, as much as we'd like to reduce our nuclear weapons, we can't afford to, because the United States is developing space-based first strike attack capabilities that would be able to take out our nuclear retaliatory capability in a first strike attack. And therefore, we can't afford to reduce our nuclear weapons. This is a X-ray laser. This is based at Albuquerque, New Mexico at Kirtland Air Force Base, where they've tested it. The laser would be pointed at a satellite in space, at a quote unquote enemy satellite, and would be able to disable it. Again, at a time when the United States might be preparing to launch a first strike attack. And they don't want the so-called enemy to be able to see that there's a nuclear attack coming their way. And so with these various capabilities that they're developing today, they want to be able to blind the enemy before the battle starts. This is the first weapon that the new Space Force bragged that they had created. Its job, similar to the previous picture, the blinding of a satellite, this technology would also be used to essentially disable an enemy satellite. Again, when it comes time for the US to launch a first strike attack, for example. And then where I live here in Bath, Maine, they build destroyers for the Navy. These are called Aegis destroyers. And they launch so-called missile defense systems that have shown that they can actually go all the way up into space and destroy a satellite. 2008, a program called Operation Burnt Frost, the US launched one of these missiles from one of these ships and took out an old disabled US military satellite, showing that they could be used as anti-satellite weapons. So again, the US is working on many different technologies to be able to disrupt other countries' satellite technology, their ability to see what's coming at them at any moment. In addition, these Navy Aegis destroyers from the same launch platforms, not only can they launch these so-called missile defense systems, but they can also launch first strike attack, nuclear capable Tomahawk cruise missiles from these ships. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction. One more thing is the Cyber Command. the first time I heard about cyber warfare was in the 90s when Bill Clinton was president, and the US and NATO launched an attack on Belgrade and then Yugoslavia. The goal was to balkanize Yugoslavia, to break it up into smaller countries so the US and NATO would be able to take control of the region. Today, the US has a massive military base in Kosovo that they would have never have had if they had not essentially broken Yugoslavia up into pieces. And as it turns out, before the war started, the US military, for the first time, tested its cyber warfare technology. And what they did was they essentially crawled inside of the Yugoslavia computers with cyber, attack, shut down their air defense system, so that when US NATO warplanes were flying over Belgrade, dropping bombs, blowing up bridges, hospitals, they even hit the Chinese embassy, if you can imagine. But Yugoslavia was not able to shoot down the planes because their air defense system had been closed down by that cyber attack. Since that time, the cyber command has taken off like a rocket, and now huge amounts of money have been spent to create a broader, more effective cyber warfare command. Because of all this going on in space, remember what I said about the 1967 Outer Space Treaty that only banned weapons of mass destruction in space. It didn't ban any other kind of weapons. Now, most of these weapons that I've shown you that are being worked on by the US are not weapons of mass destruction in space. The Pentagon actually calls them weapons of selective destruction. And so therefore they fall outside of the Outer Space Treaty. Well, for probably 25 or 30 years, every single year, China and Russia go to the United Nations and introduce a resolution at the General Assembly calling for the prevention of an arms race in outer space, a new treaty that would have expanded definitions that would cover all kinds of weapons, banning them in space, keeping space peaceful, not allowing the war system to move into the heavens. Well, this resolution passes overwhelmingly at the General Assembly, and it is then sent to the Permanent Conference on Disarmament in Geneva for negotiations. And there, the United States and Israel have been blocking this treaty for the past 25 or 30 years, every year that it's introduced by China and Russia. The United States' position officially all these years is, hey, we don't need a new treaty. There are no weapons in space. There's no problem. Well, the ABM treaty banned so-called missile defense systems, the shield that would be used after a first strike attack. If you have a shield, if you're able to pick off a country's retaliatory strike after you hit them first, you have an advantage, right? You thrust with the sword and then you protect with the shield. So first strike with your weapons and then missile defense as a shield. The ABM Treaty of 1972, signed by Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev, banned these so-called missile defense systems. But when George Bush was in office, George Bush Jr., George W. Bush, he pulled the United States out of the ABM Treaty. And then from then on, missile defense has been on steroids in the United States. In 1987, here we have Mikhail Gorbachev, president at that time of the Soviet Union, along with Ronald Reagan, signing the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This is the treaty that banned the Pershing II missile. and the cruise missiles that were deployed in Germany, in England, and in Italy in 1983 by the United States. They were aimed at the former Soviet Union. But by 87, the peace movement around the world was so strong in opposition to these missile deployments that the treaty was signed. When Donald Trump was in office, he pulled the United States out of this treaty. And so now the US is preparing to introduce intermediate range nuclear missiles into Europe. At the same time, we've seen a major NATO expansion. At the time of the collapse of the former Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev was promised by then President George Herbert Walker Bush, Daddy Bush, that if he would accept the reunification of Germany, East and West Germany coming back together again, if the Soviet Union would agree to that, the United States promised that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward towards the former Soviet Union. Well, when Bill Clinton was in office, he began what he called NATO enhancement. And since that time, NATO has been on steroids, moving into Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Recently, they wanted to go into Georgia and Ukraine. And that's one of the reasons that we have the conflict that we have today in Ukraine. At the same time, the United States has built missile launch facilities in Poland and Romania. They call it Aegis Ashore. Now, remember earlier, I showed you these Navy destroyers made where I live in Bath, Maine, that can launch these missiles, either these so-called missile defense systems or these first strike attack nuclear capable cruise missiles. Well, they've taken that Aegis technology that is on those warships and they've created what they call Aegis Ashore, and they put them on the land. And so in Romania and Poland now, the US has created these launch bases that will be able to fire nuclear capable cruise missiles at Russia, and which will be able to reach Russia in just a few moments' time. It's a Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse, and hardly anybody in America knows anything about it. This is, again, one of the reasons why Russia was so adamant about demanding a security agreement with NATO and the United States, because they're reacting to this Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. At the same time, the US is deploying missile defense interceptors. These are Patriot missiles, 3rd or 4th generation. This particular one has just been put into Poland. In addition to that, I think it's important to know that NATO is expanding into the Asia Pacific, creating what they call partnerships with Australia, Singapore, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea. Recently, you've heard about AUKUS, this effort by Australia, the UK, and the US to build new submarines for us, nuclear submarines for Australia. And so it's important to ask the question, why would NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that was created to protect Europe from the former Soviet Union that doesn't even exist anymore, why would it want to move into the Asia Pacific? Well, the reason is because the NATO has grown tired with the United Nations. When NATO wants to invade another country, they have to go before the UN Security Council with a resolution asking for the support of the Security Council for their invasion, like of when they invaded Libya without permission of the Security Council. And so NATO's tired of that. And so they think that if they can create a global military alliance, they can basically walk away from NATO and say, we have international support for this upcoming invasion that we want to do in X, Y, or Z particular location. So I would suggest to you that NATO is a steroidal organization. It's on steroids and it's a danger to the planet. Now I want to talk about nuclear power and space in greater detail. This was from one of our annual meetings in Darmstadt, Germany years ago. We went to the ESA, the European Space Agency, European Operations Center, their headquarters, and we held a protest there as part of our conference for the weekend. The US has been placing in space nuclear devices since the early 1960s. On the left, you see this advertisement for this nuclear generator in space in 1961 that was launched. And in one time, one of their nuclear generators, I think it was 62 or 63, it was called SNAP 9A. It carried 2 pounds of plutonium on board. It fell back to Earth and it burned up on reentry as it re-entered Earth orbit. And the plutonium was released as dust. Dr. John Goffman at Lawrence Livermore Labs in California studied that particular accident and believes that it became one of the major contributors to the increase in cancers around the Earth today, because the wind carried that plutonium dust. And as that particular accident was studied, they found traces of it at every latitude and every longitude on the planet. These are a couple designs of other nuclear reactors, fortunately, that weren't launched. They were experimental. But the nuclear industry has long viewed space as a new market for their very unpopular product that has become, because of 3 Mile Island, because of Chernobyl and Fukushima, the accidents there at those places, nuclear power has become very unpopular on the planet. So they figure if we can move this into space, we'll be able to make massive amounts of money for both military and so-called civilian applications. This is a book published by the United States Congress. And in this book, they talk about using nuclear power, and they talk about controlling and dominating space. This particular quote at the very bottom on the right-hand side, it says, armed forces might lie in wait at that location to hijack rival shipments upon return. What they're talking about is the Earth-Moon gravity well. Look at the picture at the top of that same page. Imagine a wishing well. Imagine someone is down at the bottom of a wishing well and you're at the top. They're trying to get out, but you control the top. Gravity is on your side. You can control who can get in and out of that well. Well, they say it's the same way between the Earth and the Moon, that with armed space stations, they say, on either side of the moon, up near the top on the right, you see L4 and L5, just on either side of the moon. With armed military space stations on either side, they say, armed forces will be able to lie in wait and hijack rival shipments upon return. So if anyone else tries to go out and mine the sky in the future, but they're not authorized, they're not the right corporation, they're not the right country, the US wants to have the military capability to take them out. Because remember, the US is going to be the master of space. Also in this book, over on the left side, nuclear reactors thus remain the only known long-lived compact source able to supply military space forces with the kind of multi-megawatt power they're going to need. And then just down the bottom, larger versions could meet multi-megawatt needs, onto the next page, of space-based lasers, the Death Star, neutral particle beams, mass drivers, and railguns. Nuclear reactors must support major bases on the moon until better options yet identified become available. Amazing. They got it all planned out, the next 50 years, they say. And today, the work continues. They're working today on a nuclear rocket with a nuclear reactor for to power it, nuclear thermal propulsion, in order to get to Mars in half the amount of time that it would take a conventional rocket. They say that if you have an astronaut on board a conventional rocket, it would take a year to get to Mars. And the space radiation would be problematic for the body of the astronauts. And so they want to cut in half the amount of time it takes to get to Mars. And so nuclear reactors, they say, will be the instrument to make this possible. Well, recently I listened to a Zoom call, a conference with people from the Department of Energy and NASA and the military, where they were discussing the testing program for this nuclear reactor engine. And they said they're not going to test it on the Earth because getting environmental permission, because of the environmental problems of testing a nuclear reactor on Earth, would become very difficult. So they're going to test it just above our heads in what they call lower Earth orbit. So imagine, as they're beginning to test these nuclear reactors in lower Earth orbit, what happens if they fall back to Earth and burn up on reentry? This book is written by a NASA scientist. He says, untold riches from the asteroids, comets, and planets. Remember what I said earlier about the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. One of the provisions of the treaty said that no country, no corporation, no individual can claim ownership of any of the planetary bodies, that the heavens are the province of all humankind. And once the day comes where we can go out and begin to even consider mining the sky, it must be done with everyone in mind. All nations must benefit on the earth. No one country can control the process. Well, President Obama in 2015 signed a bill allowing US corporations to make land claims on asteroids for mining because they anticipate an interplanetary gold rush. Well, this punched a hole in the Outer Space Treaty, the provisions that said nobody can claim ownership, no country, no corporation, no individual. So the US once again deciding it's going to be the master of space. And so these are examples of mining colonies they anticipate on Mars, on the red planet. And they say that they would be powered with nuclear colonies for the mining operations. These rovers that today are driving around Mars, doing soil identification, soil sampling. Basically, they're looking for where the resources are. They believe there's magnesium, uranium, cobalt, and other minerals on Mars, and NASA tells us they're looking for the origins of life. But in fact, they're doing the basic preliminary research to decide where the best mining possibilities are. And in fact, Halliburton Corporation, you probably all heard about it from the Iraq War, Dick Cheney's involvement with Halliburton. They've been working on a drilling mechanism for years to mine the surface of Mars. And in addition, Elon Musk, who I think most of you have heard of, he wants to go and colonize Mars, but he also wants to nuke Mars. He says if he explodes 10,000 nuclear weapons over the surface of Mars, he will be able to turn Mars into a green planet like the Earth. Can you imagine that? They call it terraforming Mars. There's an organization called the Mars Society. The president of it, his name is Robert Zubrin, a Lockheed Martin executive. He calls the Earth a rotting, dying, stinking planet. And he says we have to move our civilization to Mars, and we have to terraform Mars to make it livable for all of us. So Elon Musk is selling t-shirts. You might want to buy one. Maybe you want to get a ticket to the Mars ride. But what about the Martians? What do they got to say about this, huh? I'll never forget the story about, it's a true story about when the US was planning its first moon missions, and they were going to have astronauts walk on the moon. And they went out to the desert in Arizona and New Mexico, where the ground was very much like the surface of the moon, and they had people practice with their spacesuits walking around. And there were a couple Native Americans that were sitting on a bluff watching all of this. And NASA saw them, and they got this brilliant idea. And they ran over to them and said, can we get you to send a message in your native language, and we're going to put it on this mission to the moon? And so there was an old man who didn't speak any English, but he had a young grandson who translated. And the old man said, no, I'm not interested. But they finally talked him into it. And so they ran and got a tape recorder, and they came back, and he, in his own language, he made a message. They asked the grandson to translate it, but he wouldn't do it. And so they went into town, and they went up to one Native American after another, and they would ask them to translate this message. They would play it for them, and everybody would laugh, but nobody would translate it. So when they got back to Washington, NASA went to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they found one of the Navajo people and asked him to translate it. And as it turned out, the old man said, watch out, they're coming to steal your land. In 1997, NASA launched the Cassini mission that carried 72.3 pounds of plutonium on board that was going out to deep space. But before it went out to deep space, it was going to come and do what they called an Earth flyby. It was going to come directly towards the Earth. And right before hitting Earth gravity, it was going to do a flyby around the Earth and use that gravity assist to fling it out into deep space. We organized an international campaign against this launch. And just before the launch, we had a protest at Cape Canaveral. People climbed over the fence, saying they were going to symbolically sit on the launch pad. And all over the world, including, as you see on the picture on the right, in Bangladesh, people were protesting against this Cassini mission. This was the Cassini plutonium space probe. And what we learned right before the launch, the Santa Fe, New Mexico newspaper printed this story, and then it was picked up by other newspapers. What we learned that was that during the time of the fabrication of the plutonium generators, they had many, many cases of worker contamination at the laboratory at Los Alamos in New Mexico, where they fabricated these plutonium generators. And so the point being that it's not just that there might be some theoretical accident of a nuclear power launch at some point, as they increasingly launch more of these devices, but the very processing of these nuclear space devices is problematic, because the Department of Energy has a very long and dark track record of contaminating local water supplies, local air with these plutonium, with this plutonium fuel. So we've got to think about the entire production process as we oppose nuclear power in space. One more problem today. The orbits around the Earth are becoming increasingly crowded. And there's a thing called the Kessler syndrome, K-E-S-S-L-E-R, Kessler syndrome. The scientist by the name of Kessler has predicted that because of all the orbiting space debris today, there's so much of it up there, they have to track it at the Pentagon on big screens, because sometimes some of this space debris orbiting at 15,000 miles an hour is becoming dangerously close to, like, the International Space Station that has to be moved to another orbit. Well, in 1989, I organized a protest at the Space Center against the war in space. And our speaker that day was Apollo astronaut Edgar Mitchell, one of the early moonwalkers. He's the only astronaut ever to come to a protest against the arms race in space. And that day he told us, if we ever have one war in space, it will be the one and the only war, because so much space debris will be created orbiting the Earth that we will be entombed to the planet below. We will never be able to get a rocket off the planet through this debris field. He said it would be like a piranha-laced river that you couldn't walk through or swim through. You would be destroyed. And so as we look at our world today, cell phones, internet banking, GPS signals showing us, instead of using maps like we used to use in the old days, internet banking, weather prediction, cable TV, air traffic control. Virtually everything we do on the planet today is guided and directed by space technology. So this growing situation of these crowded orbits, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, they're wanting to launch 80,000 mini satellites into space for 5G. Remember, partly for military applications, partly for civilian applications. They say they want every single person on the planet 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every minute of every day to be able to have a 5G satellite over their head anywhere they are on the planet Earth. But guess what? This is increasing the problem of crowded orbits and the likelihood of the Kessler syndrome, where everything starts crashing into each other, a cascading crash of everything, so that soon the Earth goes dark because we lose our signals from the satellites. Everything stops, grounds to a halt on planet Earth. At the same time, the launching of these rockets are putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that is punching a greater hole in the ozone layer. So we must begin to think of space as an environment that needs protection, not only from pollution from rocket launches, but from the satellites themselves that are orbiting the Earth today. This is where we are today, my friends. And few people are interested or want to know anything about this growing problem that we have. One of my dear friends in Florida, we worked together for 30 years. His name was Will Park, a great artist. He used to illustrate everything I did, every newsletter, every flyer, every poster. And this is one of his great contributions. And he was so right about it. Let's play down on the God, the heavens, the majesty of the creation, the majesty of the unknown of space, and let's play up on the size of the corporate sponsors. Thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Wow. I've been through this type of Bruce's presentation several times already, but I still need to go through it a few more times to digest all of it. I'm sure participants have many questions, so everyone please feel free to either raise your hand or put your questions in the chat box. Anyone who would like to break the ice? Let me change the gallery view to gallery view. There we go. So quiet. It seems to be everybody's overwhelmed. Here we go. Bernie, please unmute yourself.
Bruce, that was terrific. And I've been working on nuclear weapon disarmament since 1984, I think it was. And we're having a hard time today getting the danger from nuclear weapons knowledgeable in people's minds and build an effective movement to do that. I had friends who, when the space vision came out, one of them is dead right now, but she's an activist, was an activist. And they got arrested in Colorado at that time, protesting. And the charges were not brought to them because the masters of space did not want that known what was doing. They went a couple years later and did another action at one of the bases in northern Colorado and got arrested for that and so on. But the biggest question is, in terms of what you presented, is how do we get that word around? You've been working on this for years and years, and every year you have a space week and so on and so on. I don't know if you want to say anything about vision for getting the word around and what it implies, but that's where my head's breaking right now. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Bernie. It's good to see you again. I want to say before I go any further that one of the founders of the Global Network, when we created it in 1992, Carl Grossman, I notice he's on this call as well. So I hope at some point he will pop up and say a few words as well, because Carl is, his particular major interest is nuclear power and space. Carl has long been an anti-nuclear power person. So anyway, I hope he'll say something. Just to respond to you, Bernie, I support the ban movement, the nuclear weapons ban movement. I think it was a great achievement to get so many countries to sign on to it. But as I mentioned earlier, that with the introduction, well, first of all, with the withdrawal by George W. Bush from the ABM treaty when he was president, which allowed so-called missile defense to be back on the agenda. This put Russia and China in a position where they said, we can't really have any real discussions about nuclear disarmament. And so I've been trying to say to my friends in the ban movement for years that you've got to start talking about missile defense, the shield that would be used as part of the US first strike attack program. First, the sword, the first strike attack is launched by the US, and then the shield is used. Because if you don't take that shield away by coming back with a ban on so-called missile defense, Russia and China aren't going to ever agree to getting rid of nukes as much as they might like to. And so I've seen very little interest in the anti-nuclear movement in considering that position. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, enough of that.
Okay, well, the next question, let me read the question in the chat box. This is from Satoko in Canada. Thanks so much, Bruce, for your vivid presentation of the US hegemony in space. You talked about the US's scheme to develop NATO into an alternative UN where the US can do anything they want without meeting their adversaries' resistance. Is this your analysis or what is going on, or is there any document or a statement from US officials that suggest that this is the US/NATO's intention? Thanks.
I have not seen it. There might be a document out there, but I doubt that they would have made it public because it would be so controversial. Mm-hmm. But I've learned over the years, I like to imagine puzzle pieces. All the things I showed you tonight are pieces of a puzzle of US foreign and military policy. And there are many pieces of the puzzle that I did not show you tonight. I couldn't show you many other things too, that would give even greater illumination to all of this. But yes, in a way, it is my own theory, I guess you could say, but I'm not the only person that I've heard talk about this. So, but this is what I see coming together. This is the picture that I see, the writing on the wall. And this is where I believe it's going. What other reason could there be for NATO and the US to be moving NATO into the Asia Pacific? What could be the reason?
All right, thank you. Now, next, Hannah, you have a question? Please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, and thanks to Bruce for that really dense report. I just wanted to add something about this idea of the expansion of NATO in terms of Australia. Bruce referred briefly to AUKUS, which is a treaty between the US, Britain, and Australia for the introduction of nuclear-powered submarines into Australia. But it also includes an increase in US exercises in Australia, an increase in our involvement in undersea technology, in cyber warfare. And the latest announcement is that we will have a new space command. So, you know, Australia is doing its job as deputy sheriff, developing a network which, in a sense, echoes some of the points that Bruce made, into a force that can deal primarily with China. That's the aim. And although it's only very rarely stated publicly, it's quite clear. The other factor is that these introductions, military increases, have been brought in by a Conservative government. We are coming up to an election probably in May, and it is likely that the Social Democrat Labour Party will win federal government, and they are going to support this expansion. So that, you know, this is one of the little pieces of the crossword, the puzzle that Bruce has been talking about, and Australia is clearly intent on playing its part, despite a developing but not yet very strong opposition movement. Thanks.
Thank you, Hannah. It's a really important point. And just to illustrate the importance of that point, I'd like to say this. Many years ago, I read in one of these industry publications that I check on regularly, one of these aerospace executives said that Star Wars, the generic name for all of this, war in space, would be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. Now, where are they going to get all that money from? Well, the US, even after they cut a lot of social spending, which they do regularly, even after they do all of that, they still are going around the world with a tin cup in their hand. And they're going to NATO and they're saying, we need you to pay 2% of your GDP into NATO rather than 1%. Mm-hmm. They're going to countries like Australia, that's not a NATO member, but a NATO partner. Remember I said that Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Japan, Korea are NATO partners, and they're going to them and they're signing up all these countries to kick in money to help pay for this program. And guess what? When you join in with NATO, everything has to be what they call interoperable. Everything has to fit into the US technology system. And so that means you got to buy your technology from Lockheed Martin and from Raytheon and from General Dynamics and BAE in Britain, et cetera, et cetera. But guess what? Who's in charge of the tip of the spear? Who's in charge? Who's the big daddy? Who has all the technology? Who has all the satellites? Who has all the ground stations around the earth? Well, it's the US. And so just like when NATO was bombing the hell out of Belgrade during the Clinton administration, I read afterwards in Aviation Week and Space Technology, a report on the bombing campaign. And they said NATO countries were really pissed off at the United States because the US would not give them any satellite technology pictures of the success of the bombing missions. These were NATO members. These were NATO countries. Their planes were flying over Belgrade and bombing too, but they were not allowed to see anything because the US controlled the tip of the spear and didn't want anybody else to know exactly what was going on. And so this is the projection for the future, is the United States will have all these allies around the world, help create this technology for the US to be the master of space. But the US will be in charge in the end.
Hey, thank you, Bruce. Next question is from Hollis Higgins. After Hollis, I will read the question from Pamela. Holly says, what is the relationship of space programs with geoengineering and aerial spraying over communities?
I don't know. I can't answer that question. And but ultimately, I do know that I've seen a lot of chemtrails, aerial spraying, in all kinds of different parts of the world. I see it over my house in Bath, Maine frequently. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in the old days when an airplane flew overhead, that contrail, as it was called, would just be a short little thing behind the plane, and then it would dissipate very quickly.
Right.
today, these chemtrails go from horizon to horizon, and they last, and they spread out, they widen, and they last for hours at a time. So there's something going on. Many people believe they're trying to change the weather on the planet, maybe use weather as a weapon. But its connection to all of this is, I think it is a military operation in the end, but I can't give you a direct statement as to what the official connection might be.
Okay, next one, Pamela. She said, how does the Space Command fit into the massive US military exercises, and how are they being planned to be integrated to achieve full spectrum dominance? Ooh.
Well, again, going back to Aviation Week in Space Technology, one year I read an article, a description of a computer war game at the Space Command. They called it the red team versus the blue team. And in that computer war game, the United States launched a first strike attack on Russia and China. The first weapon they used was the military space plane, the one X-37 that I showed you earlier, the super drone that can stay in space for more than a year at a time. And it can fire a rocket from that plane that would then go down to Earth. And so in that computer war game, the first weapon that was used was they fired a missile from the military space plane that tried to take out the underground silos of Russia and China. They're now, I think they have 4 or 5 of these X-37s, and they're probably working on more of them. Mm-hmm. The second weapon that they used when Russia and China in the computer war game tried to fire a retaliatory strike was the Death Star, the space-based laser that fired a laser beam to try to pick off the retaliatory nuclear strike by Russia and China in that computer war game. And so they talked about in the article, they had a lawyer, a military lawyer, sitting next to the computer operators. And when they went to use the Death Star, they turned to the lawyer and said, would this violate the Outer Space Treaty? Can we use it? And the lawyer said, yes, you can, because it's a weapon of selective destruction, and the Outer Space Treaty only bans weapons of mass destruction. So I hope this partially answers your question, that they've been wargaming war from space, through space, in space for many, many years. And they're now developing the technologies to make it happen. And they're also, one of my greatest concerns today is they're creating launch sites all over the planet. Why? Why are they creating launch sites in so many places? They even want one, actually 2 of them. They want to have 2 launch facilities here in the state of Maine where I live. There's a bill right before our state legislature at this very moment. But in Scotland, in England, and there's a launch facility in Kodiak Island, Alaska. The residents were told it would only be for civilian launches, but every single launch has been for the military in the 20-some years that it's been established. And so they're building these launch facilities all over the planet. And I wonder why? Why so many of them? And especially like the one in New Zealand that we learned about. It's called Rocket Lab. They were told it's built on indigenous people's land. They went to the indigenous people, promised that it would only be for civilian technologies, to study the earth, these kind of things. And now they're launching only military launches from there. People are very angry about it. They've been organizing to try to shut it down. But I wonder, why do they need all these places that get turned into military launch sites? And so just imagine when you have many of these places, maybe you can launch many rockets in a first strike attack all at one time, coming from many different directions, from different parts of the planet, aimed at Russia and China in the future. I don't know if it's a fact, but it's another puzzle piece that I'm waiting to find out if it goes into this picture that is developing.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruce. So Satoko again, this is not her question, but she wants to make some comment. Thank you for your answer, Bruce. I agree with you totally. In fact, even liberally minded people in Canada, where I live, and in Japan, where I am originally from, talk of NATO as if it is a benign organization, somewhat like UN, whereas in fact, NATO is the largest and most powerful military alliance in the world, counting for over 60% of the world military spending, as you point out. This is why many in the West talk of the NATO encroachment against Russia, like, why not? This is just my additional comment, not a question. Thanks.
It's a good comment. I agree
Yep.
with you.
Yep, she just came back from Japan. Hi.
There's an organization, most of you are probably familiar with it, SIPRI, S-I-P-R-I.
SIPRY?
S-I-P-R-I.
Oh, okay.
It stands for Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And every year they look at military spending, the pie, and what their 2018 or 2019 numbers where the United States spent 34% of the global total that year of the global total of military spending, 34%. Russia, 3.4%. So this year's numbers, we hear a lot about Russia's trying to recreate this former Soviet Union right now, that all of Europe is under danger, that Russia wants to take over, that, you know, their attack on Ukraine is just part of a first step towards taking over all of Europe. We've all heard that. Well, Russia this year is spending, according to SIPRI, $65 billion, that's with a B, $65 billion on military spending. About 3.4, 3.5, 3.6% of the global total. US, when you add up all of its many pots of gold, don't forget nuclear weapons are in the Department of Energy budget, doesn't get counted in the Pentagon budget. So when you add up all these various military pots of gold, the US annual military budget is $1 trillion, 1 trillion with a T a year. And then when you add all the NATO countries spending to the US total, Germany, England, France, United Kingdom, you know, all the NATO countries, military spending to the US total, and now add the NATO partners in the Asia Pacific, add their money in there. It's well over 60% of the global total. So that figure is accurate as hell.
Thank you. Wow, just the numbers are overwhelming. Here's another question from Hollis. New realm of militarism is the cognitive domain. Do you see any training in the space command dealing with the cognitive domain?
Well, if I understand that question properly, please help me if I get it wrong, anyone. Cognitive means our brain, right? Our thinking, correct? So the question then is, are they doing anything to essentially weaponize our brains or create a technology to infiltrate our brains, colonize our brains, if you will? And the answer is yes. In fact, I've seen a study, I've done blog posts about a program that the Pentagon has where they're developing weapon systems to essentially colonize our brains, to essentially infiltrate our brains, and to have us do what they would like for us to do at a particular time. It would help with their soldiers, they say, but it would also help with the public to get them to support certain kinds of things that the corporate masters might like to do at a particular time. So yes, going back to Operation Paperclip, at the end of World War II, when 1,500 Nazis were brought over to this country to create the US space program, they helped create the CIA, they were put into aerospace medicine, they seeded the entire military industrial complex. But also they brought over the Nazi scientists that were doing mind control experiments in Germany on the Jews and other prisoners of war. And they created the MK Ultra and LSD and other drug experiments where people were jumping out of windows because of bad trips. These mind control experiments, these Nazi scientists were put in charge of those. And these were the elementary stages, if you will, of this cognitive domain that Hollis asks about here today, that has gotten much bigger, much wider. I would just recommend just searching on the internet for these, using the couple phrases: military, cognitive, domain, weapon, mind control. Just search those words and see what you come up with.
Yeah, just recently I've heard of MK Ultra, and just that was overwhelming. That certain individuals get targeted and detained, and went through a lot of weird experiments, so many decades, and they ended up suing the government, right? And some facts are revealing, thank God, but this is total violation of human rights.
Yes.
So how come people can control individuals like that? And I just cannot believe that our government has done such an unbelievable thing, and the freedom and democracy outside of the country.
That's why I like to always ask that question, and I'll ask it again that I asked earlier. When you bring over 1,500 Nazis and you seed the military-industrial complex with them, is there an ideological contamination that comes along with them? For example, a guy by the name of Reinhard Gehlen, he was a Hitler general. He was Hitler's head of intelligence in Eastern Europe. His job was to, during the war, rather, with the former Soviet Union, remember, Soviets lost 27 million citizens fighting the Nazis during that war. During that war, Gehlen's job was to have a rat line, as they called it, of Nazis, fascists, in all the different countries of Eastern Europe to help defeat the Soviet Union. So after the war was over, when the Nuremberg trials were starting, Gehlen went to the CIA. He went to the OSS, actually, as it was called at the time. CIA wasn't created till later, but he went to the OSS and said, you might not want to put me through these war crimes trials because I have a rat line throughout Eastern Europe that might be useful to you in this post-Cold World War II era. And so he was sent to Washington. He helped create the CIA, Reinhard Gehlen. And then after a couple of years, after they were convinced that he was, going to be working for us, they sent him to Germany. And when Germany was divided at that time between East and West. And so they sent Reinhard Gehlen to West Germany, the so-called Democratic Free Germany, and they made him the commander or the head of West German intelligence, their version of the CIA. Now imagine that. One of the top Nazi intelligence guys at the end of the war is then put in charge of intelligence in West Germany. Imagine that. And what they did was they created a program called Gladio, Gladio. And it was that we're going to make sure that we don't get any communists elected in any European country. Like Italy was going to go communist. It was pretty clear that they were going to go communist in post-World War II time. And so Gladio was an undercover secret operation run out of Germany by Reinhard Gehlen using his rat line in countries throughout Eastern Europe where they were assassinating people that communists, they were assassinating leadership, they were doing all these kind of things. And in fact, in Italy, it looked like one of the where the communists might win, Gladio killed, the BBC has done a movie about this. So it's out there now in the public venue, and there are books about it and everything. But Gladio killed the Italian guy that was running for president of Italy, and they blamed it on the communists, so that in the next election the communists were destroyed. So this is the kind of stuff that Galen and his rat line were used by the United States and this new NATO after the war to create this program of control of all of Europe. So my own opinion, others might disagree, but my own opinion is the United States has become a fascist nation. Benito Mussolini, Hitler's World War II fascist leader, defined fascism as the wedding of corporations and government.
How is that anything bad if you're?
I would suggest that in America today, we have the control of our government by corporate oligarchs, corporate power, meeting Mussolini's definition of fascism. I believe the United States is a fascist nation. And I believe there is a link back to those Nazis that were brought to this country at the end of World War II.
All right, thank you very much, Bruce. Wow, we got so much information gathered tonight, and it takes, I think at least I have to rethink and think and collect more information. And also we can check additional information related to all the keywords that he gave us tonight. And thank you so much, Bruce. And this event's video will be available after that. And again, people, please try to attend Bruce's events as much as possible, because I think we need to not only to digest this amalgamate of information, but also we need to spread the words in order to save our world, I think. And
if I could just say in closing, every month we make a space video. A Iraq and Afghanistan war veteran by the name of Will Griffin is on our board at the Global Network, and every month he makes a space video for us. His latest one I just put on my blog today. It's on our website at space4peace.org. If you go to our website, space4peace.org, and go to the resource section, in there you'll find our video library, and you'll see a string of videos that Will has made on all kinds of topics about the space issue. And so if you're really interested in learning more, please go there and check those out and help share them so that others will begin to learn. I will say that I know I've said a lot of things tonight that might seem from another planet. So I urge you to not believe a word I said, and to go find out for yourself, and to go and check for yourself to see what is really going on, and to make it your own. I've learned in my lifetime that the best way to learn is through experience. That's why I've traveled a lot in my work with the Global Network. I've been to many, many places, and at each of those places, I've learned another bit of this puzzle, if you will. And so each of you, I urge to create your own experience and find out for yourself, so you can own the truth about what's happening in the world today. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Great. Thank you so much, Bruce. And thank you
all
everyone for
coming on and
attending.
listening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Take care.